In this video, you will see a lot of interesting positions about the bishop endgame, such as bishop versus pawns, same colored bishops, and the opposite colored bishops. Imagine the situation when you have an extra bishop just chilling on the board, preparing for the next round, and all of a sudden you realize that you can't win the game. Yes, you heard it right, you can't win. Even though white has an extra bishop, there is an pawns along the h-files. We know that if both of the pawns will be gone, it will be a draw. So the only thing what white can do right now is just to capture the pawn from g5, h4 and promote the pawn. But it's not as easy as it looks like. After you play king g5, g7 and taking the pawn, surprisingly, white cannot promote the pawn on the h-file. So please always be cautious about having an extra bishop when you have an extra pawn along the h or a files. It really depends what is the promotion square. And the promotion square should be the same color as your bishop. You shouldn't really mind it if you have an extra pawn from the b to the g file. It's not a big deal, you can promote it regardless. But if that is the case, please pay attention to that. Why is this a draw? Right now, if you try to make a progress, just push the pawn forward and go all the way to h6, you can't do much. King h8, king g8 is coming, and it will lead to a stalemate position. In case of h7, king h8, there is nothing what we can do. Black's main plan here would be to go g7, h8, and that's it. And if you try to go with something like bishop d5, king h8, it's just simply a draw. This is the position what you should be looking for. Again, only thing what we did is just move the bishop away from g2 to f2. But it's already winning because h8 promotion square is a dark square, same color as the bishop. So after taking the pawn, unlike in the previous situation where we had the light squared bishop, we were playing bishop e6, h7, it was a stalemate, but right now there will be a straight checkmate, not even a stalemate chance. Bishop is a very powerful piece when it comes to stopping the passed pawns. Unlike in the previous video, if you have seen it, if not, I definitely recommend you to check it out about the knight endgames. That is a horrible piece when it comes to stopping the passed pawns, but the bishop is a completely different story. So right now, white wants to push c6 followed by c7, and this pawn definitely needs to get stopped. Black cannot play the moves such as bishop f3, because the biggest issue is that there is f5. The bishop is supposed to stop both of the pawns, while the king is very far away from it. The bishop can stop not only 2, 3 or 4, even 6 pawns if it comes down to the same diagonal. But as you can see right now, bishop cannot stop the pawns on the same diagonal. This is stopping from here and here. It will be impossible to stop them because in case of king d3, there is c6, bishop c6, which leads to f7 and white promotes the pawn. So as long as you stop the pawns on the same diagonal, you're good to go. Therefore, black plays a very powerful move, g3, sacrifices another pawn, because black clearly realizes that it's impossible to win the game. All he has to do is just to stop the pawns. After playing g3, white is forced to take it, otherwise g2 is coming. And whenever this happens, black plays bishop g4. Black is not stopping only one pawn, stops 3 pawns, but all the pawns can be stopped along the same diagonal. Therefore, it just will lead to a drawish position. For instance, if c6, king goes to d3, c7, and black can even play king c2. No need to move the king anywhere else. As long as you don't allow this king to join into the action and start pushing the pawns forward, you're good to go. Of course, black can also try to go king e3. This pawn is stopped, and these also. So please pay attention. Make sure that you're stopping the pawns on the same diagonal, otherwise your opponent will be winning the game easily. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe the channel, because whenever we reach 10,000 subscribers, there will be a free giveaway, free video courses from my website. Let's move on to opposite colored bishops. Unlike the other endgames, you might have just 1 pawn down situation, 2 pawns, even sometimes 3, and it just leans towards being theoretically drawn endgame. So if you have an extra material on the board, pay attention to the detail, try to avoid getting opposite colored bishops ending unless you are very certain that it is winning for you. In this situation, white has 2 extra healthy pawns on the flank, and it looks like it should be winning. Both the sides have the bishop. Why is this a problem? So it is black to move and goes with king d7, which actually was a wrong move. All black has to do right now is to somehow trade off this bishop into these 2 pawns, because we already know that the remaining pieces will be easily drawn for black. The reason is that h8 is a promotion square, is a dark square, and because we have the light squared bishop, white can't do anything at all. But it's not as easy as it looks, because white realizes that and tries to keep this pawns alive and to force black to not trade it into the bishop. So black has played king d7. Instead of that, it was a better idea to start with bishop f4, first just moving the bishop away, and after white goes with the b4 to go with bishop d2. It is essential to tighten down this king into the pawn right now, so there is no king c6, b6 or whatever, or easy pawn push later on. White plays a3, trying to protect the pawn. Bishop goes to c1, a4, bishop d2, and if white goes with a5, it might look like it's really a bad idea to allow white to push the pawns that much forward, but black is exactly on time to stop the pawns with the king. Now this king is tied down to the pawns. White doesn't want to push the pawn on a6 because there is bishop e3, and this is controlled very well, these dark squares. You can't push a7, and if this happens and after b6, b5, these squares are under black's control, and all they have to do is just wait and see that white can't change anything in this position. So white doesn't want to end up in this situation, therefore they can try instead of a6 the move such as king a4, which protects the pawn on a5 and tries to give some room to the pawn. But now the king goes to c7, for instance, b5 comes next, and black can even try to go with bishop e3 later on. There is no b6 coming in the future, because we know that if the bishop gets traded into these two pawns, it will be a draw. And in case of a6, if black manages just to block the pawns along the dark squares, it will be easily drawn. In the game, black has played king to d7. Even Bobby Fischer plays this position as black, and he made this big blunder. And now a4, which was counter blunder. It was important to start with b4, and because black doesn't have enough time to maneuver the bishop like that, white has enough time to bring the king on a5, b5, king a6, b6, and it would have been automatic winning. King c7 was played. Long story short, they have gotten to this position where white managed to push the pawn all the way to b6, already threatening b7, and because black can't do anything about pawn push on a5, they can try to stand there and just go to c5. There's no b7 yet. a6 will be a huge blunder because it will be just king will be tied down to the b6 pawn. But there is king a8 with the idea of playing b7 followed by b8, and there's not a single thing what black can do about it. And as you can see, in opposite colored bishops, even Bobby Fischer made this huge, massive blunder. Let's have a look at another amazing example. The game between Vasilin Topalov against Alexei Shirov. This is a legendary position, you already might have seen it. Black has two extra pawns, but it's opposite colored bishops, and as you can see, this bishop is stopping both of the pawns, d and a pawns, on the same diagonal. Therefore, it's not really so easy to play this position for win as black. If black makes a natural move such as king d6, it is enough for white to bring the king all the way to e3, so there is no d4. In case of king c4, there can be this king d2 later on, or even better will be to simply grab the pawn on f6. Because there is no d4 and it will never happen, this bishop is controlling everything along this diagonal, and black cannot win the game. Even if you play a3, for instance, white is just waiting with bishop e5 and a2, you should play king b3 at some point if you want to support the pawn, and whenever this happens, white happily goes with king d2, not allowing king c2 ideas, all the key squares are occupied, and this bishop is just dominating, and black can't play for win. Because white is on time to activate the king on f2, e3, and potentially on d4 as well, it is very important to have enough time to push this d4. You don't want to sacrifice the pawn because it will lead to a drawish position. Therefore, black made an insane move, bishop h3. Yes, bishop h3. Black wants to get rid of this bishop as soon as possible from f5 because it was like a neighbor. In the previous position when we have seen that black just tried to bring the king all the way to b3, what was this f5 bishop doing? Nothing at all. It happens frequently that if you have a different colored bishop, it doesn't really do much, so it is important to have a bit different values, and perhaps it's not even doing anything, so you might as well consider giving it up. After playing bishop h3, obviously white just wants to take it. But unlike in the previous position, right now black has not only one, not only two, three passed pawns, and also a free passage to the e4 square. So black goes king f5, and after king f2, there is king e4, very powerful move. White has an extra bishop, but these two pawns are just stopped by the g6 pawn, and there's nothing what white can do about the g6 pawn. It cannot undermine, so these pawns will never see a sunlight along the h-file. So after playing king e4, black's main intention and the idea of playing d4 already has been achieved. And if white takes the pawn on f6, which is very logical, because after king e2 there is d4, and because we have three passers, it's just impossible to stop all the pawns along the same diagonal. Black will be easily winning. So after king e4, white takes the pawn on f6. But right now there is already d4 into the action, a3, a2 is coming, and because this diagonal is blocked, black can win the game. Bishop e7 is a must, king d3, bishop c5, attacking the pawn, king c4, just getting rid of the bishop, and after that, king b3 is coming. a3, a2 is in the action, but it is important to not go for it right away, because if white takes, there is king d3, and white can actually win. Instead, black has another powerful move, such as king c2. And d3, d2 is coming. If white tries to stop both of the pawns, we already discussed that it's impossible to stop two pawns if they are not standing on the same diagonal. So there is a3, and if white captures, there is d2, followed by d1. Really an amazing example by Alexei Shirov. When it comes to the same colored bishop, it really matters how many extra pawns you have, as you would be happy to have an extra pawn in any kind of endgames. Right now, one pawn matters a lot, so you might be able to promote it without a lot of difficulties. In this position, white tries to promote this pawn all the way to e8, but we see a clear problem that this bishop is controlling it. So it is important to get rid of this bishop and try to undermine, force black to leave this diagonal, and in that case, just we want to push the pawn forward. So white starts with bishop e7. It's not really difficult to understand that motif, and after bishop a5 goes to a3. Now black has to stop the pawn somehow, since they can't stand along this diagonal. Now it's time to go for bishop to d8. White plays bishop b2 with the intention of going for bishop f6. After that, black will be forced to leave this diagonal, and it's easily winning for white. As you can see, the bishop doesn't have enough time to maneuver on another diagonal, so white wins the game. But black also can try after bishop e7 to go for the moves such as bishop to d2, for instance, trying to stand along this diagonal whenever the bishop leaves. For instance, after bishop a3, trying to play something like bishop g5 is not enough to hold a draw, because again, white plays bishop b2 followed by bishop f6. We can stand along this diagonal, but not for long. Bishop needs to leave, and there is also not enough time to try to maneuver along another diagonal, because after bishop d2, there is directly e7, and white wins the game on spot. Let's have a look at a more practical example. Alexander Khalifan plays against Salov. And as we can see, this bishop is slightly better than its counterpart on a1. The reason is because of the central squares. Black has the pawn standing on the light squares, which keeps this bishop active. And because of this d4 pawn, it really is blocking the bishop. It's very annoying to play this position as white. Well, of course, it is not enough to win the game for black, but it gives black more pleasant moves to play. Black starts with h5, tries to put the pawns on the light squares, all of it. Of course, that will be important, because these pawns cannot be attacked by enemy's bishop. And also, black, of course, wants to activate the king and go to the e4 square as soon as possible. After h5, white goes with h3, king h7, g6, basically activating the pawns and playing b4. This move is important because it blocks these bishops, cannot go on c3, and if the bishop gets to b2 square, it easily can be dominated by bishop f4. It's like the bishop is stuck, and right now, and this is just dominating, and if black has enough time to activate the king all the way to e4, it will be an easy victory for black. Therefore here, after this position, when black responds with b4, there is g3, not allowing bishop f4 ideas. Black goes with the first plan what they had, playing king f5, and bishop gets to b2. White's intention is to play bishop c1 as soon as possible, and maybe even maneuver the bishop to d2, which will be attacking the b4 pawn easily. Black goes with g5. It is important to go with g5, g4 to control the f3 square, because if you go for king e4 right away, there will be f3. The pawn is protected, this king will be chased away from e4 square. White can even try g4 or even king f2, and black cannot do much, because without an active king, if white will have sort of like a fortress, regardless of having more passive bishop, white easily holds a draw. That's why it is important that right here, after bishop b4, first black plays g5 with the intention of playing g4, controlling the f3 outpost, and then playing king e4, which will be completely dominating the whole board, will weaken the d4 pawn even more. And after maneuvering the bishop all the way to f6 and grabbing the pawn on d4, it will be winning for black. So after g5, white played bishop c1, which is actually a huge blunder. It was very important to play king d3 immediately, trying to control the e4 square. And after playing this g4, which definitely looks like a good move, there is h4. So now black can't do anything, even though all the key pawns are stacked actually along the dark squares. Black cannot just magically put the bishop on e1 or something and trying to take the pawns. Therefore, it was the best practical choice. White made a mistake by playing bishop c1, even though it looks very logical, but it actually cost them the whole game. Black responds with g4, attacking the h3 pawn, and white took the pawn here. In case of h4, it's very difficult to play this position because after king e4, pawn is weak, and after playing bishop e3, black can try two ways, either f5, f4, or even maneuvering the bishop towards this diagonal, grabbing the d4 pawn and winning the game easily because black's king is just completely active. H takes g4 was played. Probably white expected here that black would respond with h takes g4 with the idea of bringing the king on e4 square a bit later, but here of course white has king d3 and it will be a draw. Black's king cannot have the access to any of the central squares and it will end with a peaceful result. But black has completely different move in mind. King takes g4. And what white has missed is that black has the idea of playing f5 followed by f4, and if this pawn will get traded into the g-pawn, black will have an outside pass pawn, which means a lot in this kind of endings. So bishop d2, f5, bishop goes to e1, bishop e7, just a little bit of maneuvering, and at the end, black of course pushes f4. f3, king gets to h3 square. Of course, if black takes the pawn on f4, black can even try to take it back with the king, try to get to e4 square again and take the pawn for free. Also, the h-pawn will be a big distraction for white's king, and if white will try to grab this pawn and try to get the h3, black will be easily grabbing all these pawns along the queen side. Therefore, here, white tried to use some tricks by playing f3 and perhaps hoping that black cannot capture it because the b4 pawn also gets weakened, and it might not have been the best try for white, but it's very practical actually. You can't really blame them trying for it. But black here plays an extremely powerful move, king to g2. Right now, the biggest problem what white has is that black is threatening to play bishop e7 and keeping this pawn on b4 protected, at the same time trying to go for h4 followed by h3, which will cause a lot of problems in white's camp. It will be difficult to hold on to this position. f5, bishop goes to e7. I know it's really overworked this bishop, but it's doing the job excellently, protecting the b4 pawn, controlling this diagonal, and also supporting the pawn on h4. The game continued with f6, bishop takes, bishop b4, h4, and basically whenever the pawn reached to the h3 square, there are many ways how black can win the game, of course, but bishop e7, the cleanest way, clearly is the best. Because if bishop e7, there is h2, the pawn cannot be stopped. And if the bishop leaves from d6 square going back to e5 or anything like that, black takes the pawn on b4, then comes back to all the way to g3, h2 is coming next, and of course, black celebrates the victory. If you're interested in more endgame educational content, you definitely need to check out this playlist, which will show you the pawn endgames and the knight endings. If this is the first video which you clicked, I highly recommend you to check out other videos as well.